It was upon a cold November evening in London, when the fog lay thick upon the streets like a living veil, that I first witnessed the singular event which would later become known in my notes as the most dangerous case ever presented to my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The city beyond Baker Street was muffled beneath the heavy breath of the Thames mist, and the gas lamps burned dimly, as though reluctant to reveal what lurked within that gray obscurity. Holmes and I had spent the better part of the evening in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street, where the warmth of the coal fire struggled valiantly against the damp chill that seeped through every London wall in winter. My friend sat languidly in his armchair, long legs extended toward the hearth, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by the flicker of flame. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from his pipe as he studied the front page of the evening paper, with the distant expression that I had come to recognize as the calm surface of a restless and brilliant mind. Holmes had been in a curious mood that evening, restless yet restrained, as though his mind yearned for a problem worthy of its talents, yet suspected that none would soon appear. The newspapers were filled with the usual petty crimes and scandals of London society, none of which stirred the slightest interest in him. I, for my part, had been reviewing several notes from my PHF. My only lipstick, Ruby Kiss. Ruby Kiss, Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss. Only Ruby Kiss has the luxurious texture that taste air, excise to react, and medical practice. When Holmes suddenly lowered the paper and fixed me with a glance that carried the faintest trace of amusement. "My dear Watson," said he in that languid voice of his, "you have today encountered a man who has recently returned from the Continent, who suffers from a mild injury to his left ankle, and who, if I may venture the further observation, has had an unfortunate dispute with a tailor." I stared at him with no small astonishment. "Holmes, I assure you, I have mentioned none of these things." "Indeed you have not," he replied calmly. "Yet the evidence is quite apparent. The faint clay upon the hem of your trousers is of a reddish hue found most commonly along the southern French coast. The slight stiffness with which you crossed the room earlier betrays a recent strain to the ankle, and the loose thread upon your sleeve suggests that you have been impatiently pulling at your cuff, a habit you only indulge when irritated by some minor professional inconvenience." I could not help but laugh, though his conclusions proved entirely correct. Such moments of casual brilliance were commonplace in our rooms, yet they never failed to renew my admiration for the extraordinary analytical powers of my companion, the incomparable Sherlock Holmes. Our light exchange was interrupted at that moment by the sudden arrival of Mrs. Hudson upon the staircase. She entered with her usual brisk propriety and carried in her hand a single envelope of thick cream paper. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. Holmes accepted the envelope with a faint nod of thanks, though I noticed immediately that his expression had altered, even before breaking the seal. He studied the paper with the keen attention of a scientist examining some rare specimen. "Curious," he murmured. "What is it?" I asked. "Observe, Watson." He handed me the envelope. I noticed first that the address had been written in a firm yet strangely deliberate hand, each letter spaced with unusual care. The paper itself was of exceptional quality, far finer than one would expect for ordinary correspondence. "Expensive stationery," I remarked. "Precisely, yet posted from Whitechapel," said Holmes quietly. That contradiction alone was enough to stir his interest. Holmes opened the letter with his penknife and unfolded the single sheet within. As his eyes moved across the page, the languid composure I knew so well began to vanish. His posture stiffened slightly, and the sharp gray eyes grew intensely focused. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he rose slowly from his chair and walked toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the glass like pale smoke. For several moments, he stood there in silence. Then, quite unexpectedly, he placed the letter into the fire. I sprang to my feet. Holmes. The paper curled instantly in the flames, the ink blackening before vanishing altogether. Within seconds, the message had been reduced to nothing more than drifting ash. Holmes watched it burn with an expression that I can only describe as deeply troubled. "My dear Watson," he said at last, his voice lower than usual, "I have just destroyed what may have been the most dangerous invitation ever extended to me." "Invitation?" I exclaimed. "To what?" Holmes returned to his chair slowly, though the composure of earlier had not fully returned. "To a case," he replied. "Well, surely," I protested. "You cannot mean that you intend to ignore it. Since when has danger deterred Sherlock Holmes?" He looked at me with a grave seriousness that I had rarely seen in him. "Since the moment," said he quietly, "that the pursuit of truth threatens to unleash something far worse than crime itself." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. I could scarcely believe what I had witnessed. Holmes, who had pursued murderers through the darkest alleys of London, who had confronted some of the most brilliant criminal minds of Europe, had refused a case, and not merely refused. He had destroyed it. Yet what troubled me far more than his decision was the unmistakable tension that now lingered in his expression. Holmes was a man who thrived upon intellectual challenge. Danger invigorated him rather than discouraged him. For him to withdraw from a mystery before even investigating it meant only one thing: whatever had been written in that letter was not merely dangerous, it was terrifying. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Holmes sat motionless, fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring into the fire with an intensity that suggested his mind was already racing through possibilities unseen to me. At last, I broke the silence. "Holmes," I said quietly, "who sent the letter?" He hesitated. Then he spoke a name so softly that I almost doubted I had heard it correctly. "A man," said Holmes, "who should already be dead." A chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the November air. Holmes rose again and crossed to the mantelpiece, where his violin rested. He lifted it slowly, though instead of playing, he simply turned the instrument in his hands. "You must forgive me, Watson," he said at last. "But this is one mystery I had hoped never to face again." I knew then, with a certainty that tightened my chest, that whatever shadow had reached into our quiet rooms that evening had come not merely from the streets of London, but from somewhere far darker within Holmes's past. And though my friend had burned the letter, the case itself had already begun. The events of that strange evening might very well have ended with the destruction of the mysterious letter, had fate not chosen to intervene with a persistence that neither fire nor caution could extinguish. I remember distinctly that the fog outside Baker Street had grown thicker as the night progressed, until the street lamps shone like faint golden halos suspended in a sea of gray. Holmes had resumed his seat beside the hearth, though he had not spoken for several minutes. The violin rested across his knee, but the bow lay untouched in his hand. It was clear to me that his mind was no longer in our sitting room, but wandering through some distant labyrinth of thought. I had known Sherlock Holmes long enough to recognize that such silences were rarely empty. Indeed, they were often the sign that his extraordinary intellect was grappling with a puzzle of unusual complexity. Yet what troubled me that evening was not his concentration, but the unmistakable tension that lingered behind it. Holmes had faced many formidable adversaries during our years together. Yet I had seldom seen him destroy evidence before even examining a case. "You cannot expect me to ignore what has happened," I said at last, unable to suppress my curiosity any longer. "Holmes, a letter arrives. You read it once and then burn it as though it contains some contagious disease. Surely you owe me some explanation." Holmes did not look up immediately. Instead, he drew a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, You are quite correct. Yet the difficulty lies not in explaining the matter, but in determining whether explaining it would place you in unnecessary danger. I laughed softly at that. My dear fellow, after Afghanistan, Professor Moriarty's agents, and half the criminals of London, I should think my threshold for danger has grown rather tolerant. At the mention of that infamous criminal mastermind, Holmes' eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible shadow. Yes, he murmured. Moriarty. He spoke the name as one might mention a ghost long buried. I assure you, Holmes continued, after a moment, the letter did not come from him. But it came from someone who, in certain respects, may prove even more troublesome. I was about to press him further when the sharp ringing of the doorbell echoed through the quiet house below. Both Holmes and I turned toward the staircase. Visitors at such a late hour were not uncommon in our profession. Yet something about the timing of this arrival caused Holmes to rise slowly to his feet. Curious, he said softly. Another client, perhaps. Holmes shook his head. No, a client writes first. Watson. The footsteps of Mrs. Hudson soon sounded upon the staircase, followed by a hesitant knock. Come in, Holmes called. The landlady entered, though her usual composed manner had been replaced by something resembling mild alarm. There's a gentleman below asking to see you, Mr. Holmes, she said. He insisted it was a matter of the greatest urgency. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. Did he give his name? Mrs. Hudson hesitated. No, sir. But he said you would recognize him. Holmes' expression grew very still. Show him up. A minute later, the sound of slow footsteps approached along the corridor. The door opened, and the visitor entered. He was a tall man, though the heavy coat he wore was soaked through with fog and dampness. His hat was pulled low over his brow, casting his face partly in shadow. For several seconds he remained near the door, as though uncertain whether he had truly arrived at the place he sought. Then he stepped forward. The light from the fireplace illuminated his features, and I felt an involuntary chill run through me. The man's face bore the unmistakable signs of someone who had endured extraordinary hardship. His cheeks were gaunt, and faint scars marked the line of his jaw. Yet what struck me most was his expression, a mixture of exhaustion and desperate determination. Holmes stared at him with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. Good heavens, he murmured. The stranger removed his hat slowly. You see, Mr. Holmes, said the man hoarsely, I told you in the letter that fire would not solve this matter. Holmes took a single step forward. That is impossible. I'm afraid, the man replied. That impossibility has become the least remarkable part of this affair. I could contain my curiosity no longer. Holmes, I whispered, who is this man? Holmes did not take his eyes from the visitor. This, Watson, he said quietly, is Mr. Adrian Blackwood. The name meant nothing to me, though Holmes' tone suggested that it should. Blackwood moved closer to the fire, extending his trembling hands toward the warmth. I expected skepticism, he said. After all, the last time London heard my name, I was buried. The room fell utterly silent. Holmes folded his arms. You were not merely buried, Mr. Blackwood, he said coldly. You were declared dead after a shipwreck off the Norwegian coast nearly 4 years ago. Quite correct. Then explain, Holmes demanded, how you have come to stand in my sitting room tonight. Blackwood gave a faint, humorless smile. That, Mr. Holmes, is precisely why I came to you. Holmes remained silent. Blackwood continued in a lower voice. You were the only man in England who might have understood the danger I discovered. That is why I wrote the letter. Holmes' gaze sharpened. And yet you chose to approach me in person. Blackwood nodded slowly. Because if I had not, he said, I would already be dead. I felt the tension in the room tighten like a drawn wire. Holmes walked slowly to the mantelpiece, his long fingers resting lightly against the wood as he studied the man before him. "Let us assume for the moment," Holmes said carefully, "that your survival is not a trick of deception. That still leaves one essential question unanswered." Blackwood met his gaze. "What question?" Holmes' voice became very quiet. "Why," he said, "did your letter contain a warning that investigating this case would lead to my death?" For a moment the man said nothing. Then he spoke the words that would forever alter the course of that night. "Because," said Adrian Blackwood, "3 men who attempted to investigate it before you have already been murdered." I felt the air leave my lungs. Holmes, however, remained perfectly still. "And you believe," Holmes said calmly, "that the same fate awaits me?" Blackwood's eyes flickered toward the fire where the letter had burned. "I do not merely believe it," he replied. "I know it." Holmes stood silent for a long moment. Then, to my astonishment, he turned away from the man and spoke. With cold finality, "I refuse the case." The words struck the room like a pistol shot. Blackwood stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot be serious. I rarely joke about matters of death, but Mr. Holmes." Blackwood insisted desperately. "You are the only man capable of." Holmes raised his hand. "Enough." The sharpness of his tone silenced the man instantly. "I suggest," Holmes continued, "that you leave London at once and never speak of this matter again." Blackwood's face drained of color. "You don't understand," he whispered. Holmes turned back toward him, his expression grave. "Oh, I understand far more than you imagine." Blackwood shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "If you truly understood, you would know that refusing the case will not save you." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And why is that?" Blackwood looked toward the door as though expecting someone to appear there at any moment. "Because the moment I entered this house," he said quietly, "whoever is behind this mystery already knew." A heavy silence settled over the room. Then Blackwood spoke the words that would haunt me for years afterward. "And now," he said, "Mr. Holmes, they know where you live." The extraordinary conversation with Mr. Adrian Blackwood might have ended in dismissal had I not witnessed a peculiar transformation in my friend during the minutes that followed. Holmes had refused the case with a firmness that seemed final, yet the moment Blackwood departed from Baker Street, a subtle but unmistakable change occurred in his demeanor. The door had scarcely closed behind our visitor when Holmes crossed swiftly to the window and parted the curtain with 2 long fingers, peering into the fog-drowned street below with the keen watchfulness of a hunting hawk. I joined him there and saw only the blurred glow of the gas lamps and the dim silhouettes of passing carriages. Yet Holmes appeared to study the scene with intense concentration. For several moments he said nothing, and I could hear only the distant rumble of wheels upon wet cobblestones and the faint hiss of the fire behind us. At last he stepped away from the window and returned to the hearth, his face thoughtful but composed. "You see, Watson," he began slowly, settling once more into his armchair, "there are occasions when refusing a case is the most effective method of investigating it." I confess that this remark astonished me almost as much as his earlier refusal. "Then you do intend to investigate the matter?" I asked eagerly. Holmes leaned back and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. A posture that I had learned signaled the awakening of his formidable analytical powers. "Let us say," he replied, "that I intend to observe it." Observation, my dear Watson, is often the first step toward understanding. Investigation, by contrast, has the unfortunate habit of alerting those who prefer their secrets undisturbed. I could not suppress a smile at this subtle distinction. It was precisely the sort of intellectual maneuver that Holmes delighted in. Though he had outwardly rejected the case, his curiosity had clearly been awakened. And once that occurred, there was little in heaven or earth capable of diverting him from uncovering the truth. The fire had burned lower during our visitor's departure, and Holmes stirred the coals thoughtfully with the poker. As the flames rose again, they illuminated the ashes of the letter he had destroyed earlier that evening. Holmes gazed at them with a faintly ironic expression. "A regrettable necessity," he murmured. "You regret burning it?" I asked. "Only slightly," he replied. "Fortunately, I possess a memory that is inconveniently precise." He rose then and crossed to the writing desk, where he selected a sheet of paper and began sketching several lines of text. I watched in fascination as he reproduced with remarkable accuracy the contents of the mysterious letter that had vanished in the flames scarcely an hour before. "You remember the entire message?" I exclaimed. Holmes glanced at me briefly. "Word for word." When he had finished writing, he handed the sheet to me. The message, though brief, was deeply unsettling. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, if you value your life, burn this letter and forget the name Adrian Blackwood. 3 men have already died seeking the truth behind what I discovered. I fear I shall be the 4th. Yet if you possess the courage for the most dangerous case of your career, meet me before midnight at Baker Street." A Blackwood die read the message twice before returning it to Holmes. "If the man feared for his life," I said thoughtfully, "why not go directly to the police?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because the police would have dismissed him as a madman, which, I suspect, is precisely what someone wishes the world to believe. Someone." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes gleaming with renewed interest. "Consider the situation, Watson. A man officially declared dead reappears in London, claiming knowledge of a deadly secret. 3 investigators have supposedly been murdered, and yet no such crimes appear in the newspapers. That suggests one of 2 possibilities. Either the deaths occurred under circumstances that concealed their true cause, or the victims themselves possessed reasons for avoiding public attention. I considered this carefully, but found myself no closer to understanding the mystery. Holmes rose abruptly and began pacing the room with long, restless strides. Whenever he moved in this manner, I knew that the machinery of his mind was turning at tremendous speed. "There is also the matter of Mr. Blackwood himself," Holmes continued. "Did you observe his hands, Watson?" "Only that they trembled slightly." "Indeed. But the trembling was not caused by fear. It was the residual effect of prolonged exposure to cold climates. Notice also the weathering of his skin and the salt stains upon his coat. These are signs of a man who has spent considerable time at sea. You mean he truly survived the shipwreck?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "That much, at least, appears plausible." At that moment, a sudden sound interrupted our discussion. It was faint but unmistakable, the distant echo of hurried footsteps outside in Baker Street. Holmes halted mid-stride. He murmured softly, "What is it?" Instead of answering, Holmes returned swiftly to the window and again parted the curtain. I moved beside him and saw a small crowd gathering near the corner of the street. A constable's lantern swung through the fog, casting brief flashes of yellow light across the pavement. Holmes' expression hardened. "Something has happened," he said quietly. Within moments, the truth became clear. 2 policemen were lifting a figure from the ground near the edge of the street. Even through the swirling fog, I could see the limp posture of the body. A chill ran through me. "Holmes," I whispered. "Surely it cannot be." Holmes said nothing. He seized his coat from the chair and strode toward the door. "Come, Watson." We descended the stairs and stepped out into the damp London night. The fog clung to our clothes like wet cloth as we hurried toward the gathering crowd. The gas lamps flickered dimly above us, and the murmurs of bystanders grew louder as we approached. A constable attempted to block our path. But Holmes spoke a quiet word that persuaded the man to step aside. The body lay upon the pavement beneath the lamp. One glance was enough. It was Adrian Blackwood. His face, which only minutes before had shown such desperate determination, was now pale and motionless. A dark stain spread slowly across the front of his coat. I felt my heart sink. Holmes knelt beside the body with the calm precision of a surgeon examining a patient. His fingers moved quickly but carefully as he inspected the wound. "A single blade," he said quietly, "driven upward beneath the ribs." "Good Lord," I murmured. The constable leaned closer. "Do you know the gentleman, sir?" Holmes rose slowly to his feet. "Yes," he replied. "Then perhaps you can. Tell us who might have done this." Holmes gazed down at the lifeless figure with an expression of grave contemplation. "My dear officer," he said softly, "if Mr. Blackwood spoke the truth tonight, then the answer to that question may prove far more disturbing than you imagine." The constable frowned in confusion, but Holmes offered no further explanation. Instead, he reached gently into the dead man's coat pocket and withdrew a small folded piece of paper. He opened it, studied it briefly, and for the first time that night I saw genuine alarm flash across his face. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed the paper to me without a word. Upon it was written a single sentence: "You should have refused the case, Mr. Holmes." Below the message was a symbol, drawn in dark ink, a strange circular mark intersected by 3 narrow lines. Holmes stared at it in silence for several seconds. Then he spoke in a voice that carried none of his earlier reluctance. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe I have just discovered why this is the most dangerous case of my career." I looked at the lifeless body, the cryptic symbol, and the fog swirling through the lamplight, and I felt the first true weight of the mystery pressing upon us. For Holmes had refused the case, yet someone had already begun the killing, and that meant only one thing: the game, whether Holmes wished it or not, had already begun. The grim discovery of Adrian Blackwood's body cast a heavy shadow over Baker Street the following morning, and though the fog had lifted somewhat from the streets of London, the atmosphere within our sitting room seemed darker than ever. I had slept little that night, for the image of the fallen man beneath the gas lamp and the ominous note found upon his person had troubled my thoughts long after we returned from the scene. Holmes, on the other hand, appeared strangely invigorated by the events, though his expression retained that cold intensity which I had come to associate with the early stages of one of his most complex investigations. Despite his earlier refusal of the case, it was now evident that the matter had drawn him irresistibly into its depths. As I entered the sitting room shortly after breakfast, I found Sherlock Holmes standing beside the window with his back toward me, gazing out upon the passing traffic of Baker Street. The morning light revealed the faint traces of chalk upon his fingers, and a glance toward the mantelpiece showed that he had already been studying the strange symbol found in Blackwood's pocket. Several variations of the mark had been sketched upon a sheet of paper, each surrounded by notes written in Holmes' precise hand. It was clear that my friend had spent the early hours of the morning engaged in one of his silent analytical battles. "You have been busy, Holmes," I remarked as I approached. "Productively so," he replied without turning, "though I fear the conclusions toward which the evidence leads are somewhat disturbing. Have you identified the symbol?" Holmes finally turned and regarded me with a thoughtful expression. "Not with absolute certainty. However, its structure suggests that it may represent a private emblem rather than a commonly recognized sign. Secret societies, Watson, often employ such devices simple enough to reproduce, yet obscure enough to evade casual identification. Then Blackwood was involved with such a society." Holmes lifted one shoulder slightly. "Possibly. Yet it would be unwise to commit ourselves too firmly to that theory before further evidence presents itself." He spoke with unusual caution, which only deepened my curiosity. I was about to inquire further when the sharp knock of a cane sounded against the door below, followed shortly by the familiar footsteps of Mrs. Hudson ascending the staircase. When she entered, she carried with her a visiting card upon a small silver tray. "There's a gentleman from Scotland Yard asking to see you." "Mr. Holmes," she said. Holmes raised an eyebrow as he accepted the card. "Ah," he murmured, "as predictable as sunrise." He handed the card to me, and I saw at once the name printed upon it, Inspector Lestrade. Within moments, the inspector himself appeared at the doorway. He removed his hat with brisk efficiency and stepped inside, though his expression suggested a mixture of irritation and triumph that I had observed on several previous occasions during our acquaintance. "Morning, Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," he said with a curt nod. Holmes gestured toward the armchair opposite his own. "Pray sit down, Lestrade. I assume your visit concerns the unfortunate death of Mr. Adrian Blackwood." Lestrade's lips tightened slightly. "It does indeed," he replied. "And I thought you might be interested to know that we've already made considerable progress." Holmes settled into his chair with a faintly amused expression. "Progress in what direction?" "The direction of the murderer," Lestrade said with quiet satisfaction. This announcement immediately caught my attention, for the events of the previous night had seemed far too mysterious to admit of such rapid resolution. "You have identified the killer?" I asked. Lestrade nodded. "Or at least the most likely one." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled. "I should be delighted to hear the details." Lestrade withdrew a small notebook from his coat pocket and flipped it open. "The victim, Mr. Adrian Blackwood, was found with a single stab wound beneath the ribs. The weapon was likely a narrow-bladed knife, which we have reason to believe belonged to a man named Thomas Granger." Holmes' expression remained neutral. "And who is Mr. Thomas Granger?" "A former associate of Blackwood's," Lestrade replied. "They were partners in a shipping enterprise several years ago. The partnership ended rather badly when Granger accused Blackwood of financial fraud. There was talk of legal proceedings, but the matter was never pursued after Blackwood's supposed death." "That does sound suggestive," Holmes admitted. Lestrade nodded with increasing confidence. "Quite. Our men located Granger early this morning in a boarding house near the docks. When confronted, he attempted to flee, which, Holmes observed calmly, is rarely considered a sign of innocence." "Exactly," said Lestrade with satisfaction. "We searched his room and found this." From his pocket, he produced a small leather sheath containing a narrow dagger. Even at a glance, I could see that the blade bore a dark stain along its edge. "Blood?" I asked. Lestrade nodded grimly. "And the size matches the wound perfectly." Holmes rose from his chair and examined the weapon closely, though his face revealed nothing of his thoughts. "An elegant little instrument," he remarked. "It's enough to hang him," Lestrade said. Holmes turned the dagger slowly in his fingers before returning it to the inspector. "Have you questioned Mr. Granger regarding his whereabouts last night?" "We have," Lestrade replied. "He claims he was walking along the river at the time of the murder." "And do you believe him?" Lestrade snorted. "Hardly." Holmes walked slowly back to the window and gazed out into the street. "There is also the matter of motive," he said thoughtfully. Lestrade spread his hands. "Financial ruin, professional humiliation, and a personal grudge. If you ask me, the motive couldn't be clearer." Holmes remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke in a tone so mild that only I, who knew him well, recognized the hidden skepticism within it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is indeed remarkably clear." Lestrade mistook the remark for agreement. "We'll have the fellow formally charged by this afternoon," he continued. "Given the evidence, the magistrate won't hesitate to remand him for trial." Holmes finally turned from the window. "Tell me, Lestrade," he said, Did you happen to notice anything unusual about the body of Mr. Blackwood? The inspector frowned slightly. Unusual in what way? For example, Holmes continued casually. The small folded note found in his pocket. Lestrade blinked. Note. Holmes' eyes sharpened. You mean to say that your men failed to recover it? Recover what? Lestrade demanded. Holmes said nothing. I felt a sudden tightening in my chest as the significance of the moment became clear. The threatening message, the one that had been placed upon Blackwood's body, had been found only by Holmes, and Holmes had said nothing about it to the police. Lestrade studied him with growing suspicion. If there was a note, the inspector said slowly, perhaps you'd care to explain why you neglected to mention it. Holmes regarded him calmly. Because, he replied, its contents would have complicated your theory considerably. Lestrade crossed his arms. How so? Holmes walked back to the writing desk and picked up the sheet of paper upon which he had copied the message from the previous night. He handed it to the C. Inspector Lestrade read the sentence once. Then, again, his expression shifted from confidence to confusion. You should have refused the case, he read aloud. The inspector looked up sharply. What does that mean? Holmes' voice was quiet, but unmistakably firm. It means, he said, that Mr. Blackwood was murdered not by a former business partner seeking revenge, but by someone who wished to silence him before he could reveal the truth. Lestrade frowned. Then why leave such a message behind? Holmes' eyes glinted faintly. Because, he said, the murderer wanted me to see it. A heavy silence settled over the room. Lestrade looked from Holmes to the note and back again. You're suggesting this crime was directed at you? Holmes inclined his head slightly. It appears so. Lestrade shook his head impatiently. Now see here, Holmes, that's all very dramatic. But we've got a man with motive, a weapon, and a failed attempt to run from the police. That's more than enough evidence for me. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Lestrade, I do not dispute that Mr. Thomas Granger may be guilty of something. Then you agree? Holmes' smile faded. I merely suggest, he said quietly, that the true author of this murder is someone who prefers that you arrest Mr. Granger. The inspector stared at him in irritation. And why would anyone want that? Holmes turned once more toward the window, where the pale London sunlight struggled through the drifting fog. Because, he said slowly, Mr. Granger is far too perfect a suspect. His voice carried a note of certainty that caused a chill to pass through me. For I knew that when Holmes described something as too perfect, it meant that somewhere in the shadows of London, the real criminal had already begun to prepare his next move. The departure of Inspector Lestrade left behind an atmosphere of uneasy contemplation within our Baker Street sitting room. The inspector had gone away with visible reluctance, clutching the copied note Holmes had shown him and muttering something about overcomplicating a perfectly simple murder. Yet I knew my friend well enough to recognize that Holmes had already dismissed the police theory entirely. Whenever the authorities reached a conclusion too swiftly, Holmes' suspicions were almost certain to turn in the opposite direction. The case of Adrian Blackwood, far from being resolved, had only begun to reveal its darker and more perplexing dimensions. For several minutes after Lestrade's departure, Sherlock Holmes remained standing beside the writing desk, studying the strange circular symbol that had been copied again and again upon the paper before him. His long fingers tapped the surface of the desk in a slow and rhythmic pattern that suggested deep concentration. The fire had burned low, and the pale winter sunlight creeping through the window illuminated the thin lines of chalk and ink that now covered nearly half the page. "You are convinced Granger is innocent?" I asked at last. Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not innocent, Watson. merely irrelevant. That seems a curious distinction. Holmes gave a faint smile. Many men commit crimes in London every day, my dear fellow. The difficulty lies in determining which crimes actually matter. He picked up the sheet of paper bearing the copied message from Blackwood's pocket and held it toward the light. His keen eyes scanned the handwriting as though searching for some microscopic detail, invisible to the ordinary observer. You will observe, he continued thoughtfully, that the message contains no threat of violence. It merely states that I should have refused the case, which you did. I reminded him, precisely. Holmes placed the note back upon the desk and folded his arms. Yet Mr. Blackwood was murdered nonetheless. That contradiction suggests something most intriguing. And what is that? Holmes turned his gaze toward the window again, where the bustle of Baker Street had begun to swell as midday approached. It suggests that the message was not intended as a warning. I felt a sudden chill. Then what was it? Holmes' voice dropped slightly. A demonstration. I stared at him in confusion. A demonstration of what? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the mantelpiece where his violin rested. He lifted the instrument slowly, turning it in his hands as though contemplating some distant memory. A demonstration, he said quietly, of how easily a man can be silenced. His tone carried such quiet certainty that I felt a momentary unease. Holmes was rarely disturbed by the crimes we encountered. Yet something about this case seemed to have stirred a deeper concern within him. Before I could question him further, Holmes set the violin aside and abruptly reached for his coat. "Come, Watson," he said briskly. "Where are we going?" "To pay a visit to Mr. Thomas Granger." I confess that this suggestion surprised me greatly. "But Lestrade already has the man in custody." "Exactly," Holmes replied, "which makes him the safest person in London at present." Within half an hour we were seated in a hansom cab, rattling through the crowded streets toward Scotland Yard. Holmes remained unusually silent. During the journey, though I could see from the slight narrowing of Tweetney Mell, my only lipstick, my squeaked. My only lipstick, Ruby Kiss. Ruby Kiss, my lipstick, Ruby Kiss, only Ruby Kiss, has the luxurious texture. That, my squeak, my and my. It's his eyes, that his mind was working relentlessly through the fragments of evidence before him. The fog had thinned considerably since the previous evening. Yet the city still carried the gray melancholy that seemed inseparable from London winters. When we arrived at the Yard, Lestrade greeted us with thinly concealed irritation, though he agreed after some persuasion to allow Holmes a brief interview with the prisoner. We were conducted through a series of narrow corridors until we reached a small interrogation room where the accused man awaited questioning. Thomas Granger proved to be a burly fellow of perhaps 40 years, with weathered features and a heavy beard that suggested a life spent largely at sea. When he saw Holmes enter the room, his expression shifted from weary resignation to cautious curiosity. "So you're the famous detective," he said gruffly. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I understand you were once acquainted with Mr. Adrian Blackwood?" Granger gave a harsh laugh. "Acquainted? That scoundrel nearly ruined my life." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "And yet you did not kill him." Granger's eyes widened slightly. "That's what I've been trying to tell them." Holmes pulled out a chair and sat opposite the man with calm deliberation. "Tell me, Mr. Granger," he said, "when did you last see Blackwood alive?" Granger hesitated before answering. "About a week ago." His reply immediately caught Holmes' attention. "Indeed? That is interesting, considering the man was believed to have been dead for 4 years. Granger leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "That's exactly what frightened me." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Explain." Granger glanced nervously toward the door, as though fearing someone might overhear. He came to see me at the docks, the man continued. Looked half-starved and scared out of his wits. Said he'd discovered something terrible out at sea. Something people were willing to kill for. What kind of discovery? Holmes asked quietly. Granger shook his head. He wouldn't say. Just kept repeating that he had to find someone clever enough to understand the danger. Did he mention my name? Granger nodded slowly. He said there was only one man in England who might solve it. I could not help but glance toward Holmes at this remark, though my friend remained perfectly composed. What happened next? Holmes asked. Granger's expression darkened. I told him to stay away from me. Whatever trouble he'd found, I didn't want any part of it. Holmes leaned back slightly. And yet you were walking near Baker Street last night. Granger stared at him in surprise. How did you? Holmes smiled faintly. The mud upon your boots is identical to the clay found along the northern end of Marylebone Road. Granger shook his head in disbelief. I wasn't following him, he insisted. I swear it. Then why were you there? The man hesitated. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. Because Blackwood told me something before he left the docks. Holmes leaned forward again. And what was that? Granger swallowed uneasily. He said if anything happened to him, I should remember a name. Holmes' eyes flashed with sudden interest. What name? Granger lowered his voice to a whisper. He said the danger started with a man called, but before he could finish the sentence, a sudden commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Raised voices echoed through the walls, followed by the hurried footsteps of a constable rushing toward the interrogation room. The door burst open. Lestrade appeared in the doorway, his face pale with alarm. Holmes, he said urgently, you'd better come quickly. Holmes rose instantly. What has happened? Lestrade hesitated only a moment before answering. It's the prisoner in the next cell. Holmes frowned slightly. What about him? Lestrade's voice dropped to a grim whisper. He's dead. A heavy silence fell over the room. Granger stared at the inspector in horror. But he was alive this morning. Lestrade nodded slowly. Yes, he said. And according to the guard, no one entered the cell. Holmes' expression hardened into that cold, focused look I had seen on only a handful of occasions. A locked cell, he murmured. Lestrade nodded grimly, and no sign of how it was. Done. Holmes turned toward the door without another word as we followed Lestrade down the corridor. I felt the growing weight of the mystery pressing upon us, for a man had just died inside Scotland Yard itself, and whoever had killed him had done so without ever being seen. Holmes stopped abruptly outside the cell. Doran looked back at me. My dear Watson, he said quietly, I believe we have just encountered the first true clue in this affair. Then why, I asked, do you look so troubled? Holmes' gaze drifted briefly toward the strange symbol he had copied earlier that morning. Because, he replied in a low voice, this clue confirms something I had hoped was not true. What is that? Holmes hesitated. Then he spoke the words that would haunt the remainder of the investigation. That the enemy we face, said, is far more organized, damned, far more ruthless than I first imagined. Yet even then, Holmes did not reveal the single inconsistency. He had already discovered a clue so small that no one else had noticed it, and one that he would not explain to anyone, not even to me. The events at Scotland Yard had left a lingering tension over Baker Street that no amount of coal, fire, or morning sunlight could dissipate. Holmes returned to our sitting room with a deliberate slowness, his long coat damp from the foggy streets and his expression betraying a rare intensity that made even me, accustomed as I was to his moods, feel a trace of unease. The morning had already brought a fresh wave of uncertainty. Adrian Blackwood was dead. The prisoner in the yard had inexplicably perished, and the carefully laid plans of Lestrade and his officers had unraveled before the first hour of daylight. Yet Holmes walked with a quiet purpose, placing his hands behind his back and pacing slowly as if the very floorboards could reveal the answers he sought. I followed him, heart heavy with apprehension, and dared to ask the question that had been pressing upon me since the events of the night before. "Holmes, do you truly believe that Blackwood's murder and the death in the yard are connected?" Holmes paused mid-step and regarded me with those piercing gray eyes that seemed to measure not only my words, but the very weight of my understanding. "Connected, Watson?" he said softly, almost in a whisper. "They are inseparable. Consider the circumstances. Both men silenced before they could reveal a critical secret. Both deaths orchestrated to appear unrelated. Both designed to mislead those who might otherwise seek the truth. This pattern is no accident. It is the careful work of a mind that anticipates every move of those who pursue it." He stopped at the window and drew the curtain aside, letting the pale winter light fall across his sharp features. "And there is more," he continued, turning toward me. "Observed, Watson, that the second death occurred in what should have been the safest possible environment. Within the walls of Scotland Yard, the murderer is no ordinary criminal. Whoever orchestrates these events is meticulous, precise, and willing to confront even the institutions of law to achieve their ends." I felt a chill as his words sank in. It was one thing to face a murderer in the foggy streets of London. It was quite another to confront one who could strike within the very heart of authority without detection. Holmes' hand rested on the mantelpiece as he continued, tracing the lines of the copied note from Blackwood's pocket. The one whose ominous words had begun this entire chain of events. "Watson," he said quietly, "the stakes have escalated far beyond what I first anticipated. Blackwood's warning was not idle. The danger is now immediate, personal, and cunningly concealed. I may have refused the case initially, but events have refused to honor my decision." I stepped closer, watching him pace, knowing from experience that his mind was constructing and discarding theories at a speed impossible for any ordinary observer to follow. "Then what is our next step?" I asked. Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on the faint fog drifting past Baker Street. "Observation, patience, and subtlety," he said. "We must learn to see what others cannot. The murderer has begun a game of shadows, and if we are to survive, we must first understand the rules, though the rules themselves may be as treacherous as the players." A faint tapping at the door interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson entered hesitantly, carrying a small envelope that bore no name or address. Holmes took it from her hand without a word and slid it open with his penknife. The paper inside contained only a single line, written in careful, precise script. "You are already too late." Holmes' lips pressed into a thin line, and I felt the tension in the room deepen. He placed the envelope on the table and began turning it over in his hands, studying it as though it contained some invisible secret. "Watson," he said finally, "this is no longer merely a puzzle. It is a warning, a second demonstration of the murderer's skill and reach. The death in the yard was deliberate, calculated to instill fear and confusion. And now, it appears, the game has truly begun in earnest." For the remainder of the morning, Holmes worked with an almost feverish intensity. He inspected the envelopes and notes, examined his collection of Blackwood's previously gathered papers, and even scrutinized my own medical kit for seemingly irrelevant traces of information that might serve as hidden clues. Every observation he made, every thought he pursued, led him closer to a conclusion he did not yet voice. And though I pressed him for insight, his replies remained calm but cryptic, designed to draw my attention to the pattern of danger without revealing its precise nature. By midday, it became apparent that the stakes had risen far beyond ordinary investigation. The murderer had anticipated every obvious move and left behind evidence only to mislead the authorities. The fog of uncertainty had thickened over London, and I realized, with a mixture of dread and admiration, that Holmes was facing the most intricate, perilous, and intellectually demanding challenge of his entire career. And, as I watched him trace the lines of the cryptic symbol from Blackwood's note once again, I understood that the true danger was not merely physical, but psychological. The enemy was clever, patient, and ruthless, and the shadow of that enemy now loomed over 2-1B Baker Street itself. The game was no longer a distant threat. It had entered our rooms. Holmes had refused the case. Yet the case had refused to be refused. The tension that had enveloped Baker Street, in the wake of Blackwood's death and the mysterious killing within Scotland Yard, seemed almost tangible as Holmes moved with deliberate precision through the rooms of our flat. For hours he had examined notes, letters, and the curious circular symbol found in Blackwood's possession, his sharp eyes darting from one object to the next as though each held a secret only he could decipher. I watched him with a mixture of awe and concern, fully aware that, despite his earlier refusal, he had now committed himself to understanding the intricate web of danger that had already claimed to lives. The intelligence behind these murders, he had said, was far beyond ordinary criminal cunning, and I felt the weight of his words in the very air around us. Holmes' strategy began with observation of those who had already touched the case, for he understood that the murderer's reach extended far beyond the immediate scene of any crime. "Watson," he said, tapping the edge of the writing desk, "the first lesson is that those who believe themselves clever often leave clues in plain sight, clues designed to be ignored by the unwary. The key is to make the unwary see them." He paused, narrowing his eyes on the notes before him. "The murderer is not merely interested in killing. They are engaged in a demonstration, a series of controlled moves, intended to guide our attention precisely where it suits them." I observed him quietly as he moved to the window and surveyed the street below. "Then we must act as if we are invisible," he continued, almost to himself. "If they believe we cannot see, they will reveal themselves in ways impossible to anticipate." His voice carried that unmistakable mixture of excitement and danger that always accompanied the beginning of a brilliant plan. Holmes' mind, I realized, was already several steps ahead, anticipating actions that even I could scarcely imagine. Over the course of the afternoon, he devised a series of measures both subtle and audacious. First, he ensured that our comings and goings would appear entirely ordinary to any outside observer, while secretly marking the movements of those connected to the case through discreet surveillance from the street. Next, he prepared an elaborate ruse, leaving a series of letters and notes in strategic locations, each one crafted to suggest that the investigation had stalled, when in fact every move was calculated to draw the true culprit toward an inevitable exposure. Holmes instructed me to accompany him on short, seemingly purposeless walks along the river, where our presence would not attract notice, but where we could observe the patterns of movement and the behavior of individuals associated with the docks and shipping houses. As evening approached, Holmes' plan took on a more dramatic dimension. He arranged for a private meeting with Lestrade, under the pretense of discussing the case further, but in truth to provide the inspector with deliberately misleading information, enough to satisfy the police that the investigation was under control, while subtly nudging the murderer into a false sense of security. "The greatest danger," Holmes said quietly, "is that our adversary believes we are unaware. That belief is the single most valuable tool I possess. It will lure him to make a mistake that cannot be undone." By nightfall, Holmes had positioned a series of strategic decoys throughout the city. He had enlisted the cooperation of trusted informants in the vicinity of the docks, arranged for subtle signals to communicate movement between them, and even prepared a false letter that he allowed to accidentally fall into the hands of a known associate of Blackwood. Every detail, from the timing of lanterns to the placement of guards at seemingly arbitrary locations, was orchestrated to create the impression of ordinary vigilance, while in truth forming a carefully constructed trap. Throughout this meticulous preparation, Holmes maintained an almost terrifying composure, occasionally pausing to glance at me with those gray eyes that seemed to weigh the very character of my soul. "Watson," he said quietly, "it is imperative that you do not interfere. Observation without preconception is the only way to understand fully. The slightest deviation in judgment could compromise everything." As I nodded, fully aware of the gravity of his instructions, Holmes allowed himself a brief moment at the window to survey the city below. The fog had returned, curling like living smoke along the cobbled streets. The lamplight flickered through it, casting distorted shadows that danced upon walls and pavements. "Soon," he murmured, "the true nature of this mystery will reveal itself. And when it does, the lesson will be unmistakable. Those who manipulate the mind often wield a far deadlier weapon than any blade." I watched him in silence, recognizing that the trap he had devised was more than a simple ploy, was a test of intellect, courage, and perception. Every element had been placed with exacting precision, each move designed to provoke, mislead, or expose the murderer. And in that quiet, fog-laden night of London, I understood that Holmes' refusal of the case had not been an act of fear, but of strategy. By appearing to avoid the danger, he had ensured that the murderer's confidence would grow, and with confidence comes carelessness. As the hour grew late and the streets below emptied into shadows, Holmes finally turned to me with a faint, enigmatic smile. "Watson," he said, "the stage is set. Now all that remains is for our adversary to play his part." And in that moment, I knew that the most dangerous game of Sherlock Holmes' career had begun in earnest, and that every shadow, every note, every seemingly insignificant detail might carry the key to revealing a mind more cunning than any we had ever faced. The city of London had settled into an uneasy quiet by the following evening. Yet within Baker Street the air hummed with the tension of imminent revelation. Holmes moved with a restless energy, not pacing as before, but standing perfectly still, his sharp eyes tracing the intricate web of clues that had accumulated over the past days. Each fragment the cryptic symbol found in Blackwood's pocket, the staged letters, the mysterious deaths both on the streets and within Scotland Yard, and even the carefully misleading evidence placed before Lestrade had been meticulously examined and catalogued in his mind. Now, at last, he was ready to weave these threads into a coherent tapestry, one that would expose the cunning mind behind the murders and the manipulations that had nearly ensnared him. Holmes gestured toward me to sit as he laid out a series of notes and sketches on the desk, his fingers pointing to the symbol repeated throughout the case. "Watson," he began, his voice quiet but compelling, "every detail in this affair has been deliberately placed to mislead, to distract, and to test the intelligence of anyone who might seek the truth. Yet even in deception, the cleverest criminal cannot suppress all telltale signs. The murderer relies upon subtle assumptions that those observing will be too hasty, too predictable, or too distracted by emotional reaction to notice the inconsistencies." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over me. "Consider first the apparent motive for Blackwood's murder. Lestrade believed it to be Thomas Granger, an aggrieved business associate with imagined reasons for vengeance. But observe Granger's alibi, though imperfect, is supported by others. His movements are traceable. And crucially, he lacked any reason to construct a note intended to draw my attention. The murderer, however, intended precisely that, to lure a mind capable of recognition into a trap." I leaned forward, sensing the tension build. "Then the murderer's plan was to manipulate you?" I asked. Holmes' gaze flickered to the window, where the fog had begun to creep back into the streets. "Indeed, Watson. The deaths of Blackwood and the prisoner in Scotland Yard were demonstrations, calculated to communicate both threat and precision. The murderer's confidence grew from the knowledge that few could follow the chain of reasoning hidden. Behind each act, he picked up a small envelope that had been recovered from the docks the previous afternoon and spread its contents across the desk. "Here," he said, "is the proof that connects the seemingly isolated events." The documents showed shipping records, private correspondences, and coded notations, all linking one individual to each event. Notice the pattern. Every supposed crime of opportunity coincides with the movement of this single actor, who has carefully orchestrated each scenario to appear coincidental or to implicate someone less dangerous. Holmes then turned to the symbol that had first appeared on Blackwood's note. The circular emblem intersected by 3 lines is not merely decorative. It marks membership in a clandestine organization that values secrecy above all else. A society willing to eliminate those who threaten to expose them. The repetition of the symbol, along with the letters and staged evidence, identifies the murderer's methodology: intimidation, manipulation, and misdirection. I realized with a start that Holmes was pointing to someone we had encountered before. Adrian Blackwood's own trusted confidant, who had disappeared after delivering the warning letter. Then the murderer. I began, but Holmes raised a hand. "Precisely, Watson. The individual closest to Blackwood trusted, overlooked, and positioned to manipulate both victim and investigator. Every detail was designed to frame Granger while drawing me into observation rather than action." Holmes then turned to me with a sharp intensity. The murders were never about simple vengeance or financial gain. They were about control of information and the perception of danger. By demonstrating the ability to strike both publicly and within the sanctity of Scotland Yard, the murderer created a psychological advantage, attempting to paralyze even a mind as keen as mine. "And the final piece?" I asked, sensing that the culmination of his reasoning was near. Holmes' gray eyes glinted. "The final piece is the most telling. The subtle inconsistencies I observed that no one else noticed. The residue of mud on Granger's boots matched the dockside clay. Yes, but not the precise location of Blackwood's last encounter. The handwriting on the threatening note, though copied from memory, displayed a hesitancy and flourish consistent with a forgery designed to resemble Blackwood's hand. And the movements of all suspects indicate that only one person could have positioned themselves to execute these acts without leaving any trace save for the traces deliberately left for me to discover." I felt a chill run through me as the realization dawned. Holmes, in his meticulous manner, had not only traced the murderer's movements, but had anticipated every misdirection designed to ensnare us. "So all this, the murders, the notes, the decoys, was orchestrated to test you," I murmured. Holmes inclined his head slowly. "Yes, Watson. It was a demonstration of intellect, cunning, and reach. But the same cleverness that allowed the murderer to strike unnoticed has also revealed them to one capable of such observation. The game was to see who could outthink whom, and the pattern of evidence points unmistakably to the true culprit." He tapped the symbol once more. "Every detail leads to one conclusion. Blackwood's death, the Yard killing. The staged evidence, they are threads, Watson, and I have traced them to the hand that wove them." For the first time that evening, a hint of triumph softened his otherwise grim expression. "Now," he said quietly, "all that remains is to confront the individual and allow their own hubris to undo them. When faced with the exposure of their methods, the cleverest mind often reveals far more than intended." I sat back, awed by the precision of his reasoning. The layers of deception, misdirection, psychological manipulation had all been unraveled. Yet Holmes' calm assurance reminded me that the danger was not yet over. The reveal, though complete in intellect, would soon demand action. confrontation with a mind as cunning as any London had ever harbored. And in that quiet sitting room on Baker Street, I realized that the brilliance of Holmes' deduction was matched only by the audacity of the criminal he now sought to unmask. The confrontation with the true culprit, though swift, left a lingering resonance that I could not easily shake. Holmes had orchestrated every element of the pursuit, guiding the criminal into a position where the truth could no longer be concealed. Yet even after the arrest, or, in some respects, the narrowly avoided escape, though repercussions of the case remained. London, with its fog-draped streets and gaslit alleyways, seemed to exhale a cautious calm, but the weight of the events pressed heavily upon those of us who had seen the inner workings of a mind so dangerous and cunning. The arrest itself had been a masterstroke. Holmes had predicted the culprit's confidence would allow for one final misstep, and he used it to perfection. By sending misleading reports to Lestrade, planting carefully constructed evidence, and leaving subtle signals for the adversary to follow, he created a scenario in which the murderer believed they were still in control. When confronted, the criminal attempted the last, desperate gambit: denial, charm, and attempted escape, but Holmes' foresight had anticipated every possible reaction. Within moments, Lestrade and his officers had secured the individual, who now sat in custody, defeated by the very intellect they had sought to manipulate. As I watched the scene unfold, I felt a mixture of relief and awe. Holmes' capacity for strategic thinking, his understanding of human psychology, and his relentless attention to detail had combined to expose a mind that had eluded ordinary detection at every turn. Yet, even in triumph, there was a subtle tension in Holmes' expression, a reminder that the danger inherent in such cases is never entirely dissipated. The criminal, now silent and restrained, still held secrets within the mind, the echoes of which might linger long after their capture. Later, at Baker Street, Holmes and I sat by the fire, the events of the past days slowly settling into the framework of comprehension. Holmes, unusually introspective, stirred the coals with a quiet hand. "Watson," he said, "the danger in such cases is rarely in the act itself, but in the orchestration behind it. The most skillful criminal is not one who acts impulsively, but one who anticipates every response, every deduction, every measure taken by those who pursue them." I nodded, recalling the precise sequence of misdirections, the deaths intended to intimidate, and the cryptic messages designed to provoke thought. "And yet, Holmes," I said, "your refusal of the case initially did it not allow the murderer to act unchecked?" Holmes inclined his head slightly, eyes distant. "On the contrary, Watson. By refusing, I created the perception of disengagement. That perception became a tool. The adversary, believing me passive, revealed more than they realized. Sometimes inaction is the sharpest form of strategy, for it guides the mind of the enemy without their awareness." There was a long pause, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Holmes' gaze settled on the embers, and for a brief moment the world seemed to narrow to the quiet warmth of our sitting room. "The aftermath, as with the mystery itself, is instructive," he continued. "Even in victory, one must consider the consequences, the shaken confidence of the innocent, the scars left upon those manipulated, and the delicate balance between justice and retribution." I could see the weight of these reflections in his usually imperturbable face. Despite the elegance of his deductions and the precision of his strategy, Holmes remained acutely aware of the human cost embedded in every calculated move. The criminal, the victims, the witnesses, and even the enforcers of law had all been drawn into a web spun by intellect and foresight, with outcomes dictated as much by psychology as by circumstance. As the evening deepened, we sat in silence, each absorbed in contemplation. The streets of London had resumed their muted rhythm, the fog curling lazily between lamplights, yet a sense of vigilance lingered. Holmes, though outwardly composed, was already calculating, anticipating, and reconstructing each step that had led to the resolution of the case. I, as ever, could only observe and record, awed by the sheer force of his reasoning and the moral subtlety with which he wielded it. Finally, Holmes leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile playing upon his lips. "Watson," he said, almost casually, "we have concluded a matter that few could follow to its end. Yet remember this, the most dangerous minds do not reveal themselves at once. They linger in shadows, waiting for overconfidence to betray the unwary. That is why a detective must remain alert, even in the calmest aftermath." I nodded, understanding that while the immediate danger had passed, the lessons of this case would endure far longer. In the stillness of Baker Street, with the fire casting long, flickering shadows across the walls, I reflected not only on the brilliance of Holmes' deductions, but also on the subtle interplay of strategy, patience, and intellect that had transformed a most perilous mystery into a triumph of reason. For in the end, the most dangerous case of Holmes' career had been resolved not through sheer force or luck, but through foresight, discipline, and a mind uncommonly attuned to the hidden patterns of human behavior. The events of the past days had finally settled into a quiet rhythm at 221B Baker Street. Yet the echoes of the mystery lingered like a subtle fog over the room. Holmes sat in his favorite armchair by the fire, fingers steepled, eyes distant but alert, as if he were still tracing invisible lines of deduction across the city streets. I, as always, recorded the final moments of our adventure, attempting to capture in words the extraordinary combination of intellect, strategy, and insight that had resolved a case both perilous and perplexing. "I confess, Holmes," I said after a pause, "I do not believe I have ever witnessed a case that so thoroughly confounded both police and observer alike. The danger, the deception, the misdirection, it was a puzzle unlike any other." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "You have described it accurately, Watson. The most dangerous cases are seldom those that present themselves openly. They are those which challenge not only our powers of observation, but our judgment, our restraint, and our understanding of human nature. To refuse a case is sometimes the wisest course, for the mere act of engagement may precipitate outcomes one cannot control. Yet when refusal is impossible, when the consequences reach beyond our private discretion, the detective must act with care, foresight, and patience." I leaned back, considering his words. "And yet, you pursued it regardless." Holmes' eyes flickered with a rare glimmer of warmth. "Indeed, the pursuit of truth is seldom optional, Watson. One may refuse the superficial elements of a case, but the deeper principles, the moral obligations, the protection of innocence, the pursuit of justice, these are inexorable. It is not the danger that dictates action, but the imperative of reason applied to circumstance." A silence fell between us, punctuated only by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant hum of London streets outside. I realized that the events we had endured, though now concluded, had left an indelible impression upon both of us. The demonstration of intellect, the perils of cunning, and the subtle ways in which even the most brilliant minds can be tested. Holmes finally spoke again, in a tone more reflective than I had heard in many cases. "Remember, Watson, it is not always the overt criminal who is most dangerous. Often it is the unseen hand, the mind that orchestrates events from the shadows, which poses the greatest threat. To confront such a mind is to engage not merely with the actions of a man, but with his capacity for foresight, manipulation, and subtle terror. That is why I initially refused Blackwood's case, the recognition that the danger extended beyond simple physical harm. And yet, as I have always found, to understand the world in its entirety, one must sometimes place oneself at the heart of peril." I nodded, recognizing that in these quiet reflections lay the essence of Holmes' philosophy, the combination of intellect, moral responsibility, and strategic foresight that separated him from every other man I had known. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed, yet still alert to the possibilities that might emerge from the shadows beyond Baker Street. "And now," he said, after a long pause, "we await the next case, Watson. For while the danger of this one has passed, the city will always present mysteries, some trivial, others perilous each, demanding observation, deduction, and, when necessary, the courage to confront what others would flee. That is the life of a consulting detective. That is the path we walk." I took up my pen once more, recording his words with reverent care. Outside, London exhaled a fog-laden breath, as though the city itself acknowledged the resolution of another extraordinary affair. Yet within our rooms, I knew the vigilance would continue. The mind of Sherlock Holmes ever poised, ever calculating, ready to face the unseen perils and hidden deceptions that awaited around the next corner. For in the world of intellect and danger, there is no true rest, only the patient and unyielding pursuit of truth. And so ended, at least for now, the most dangerous case that Holmes had ever refused, a case that had tested his genius, his judgment, and his courage, and one that would long remain engraved in my memory as a testament to the unparalleled powers of deduction and reason, possessed by my extraordinary friend.